what has happened, I think, is that we've had new pesticides that have appeared on the market that haven't been properly evaluated independently to determine what impact they have on the bees.
Early generations of pesticides would be sprayed directly onto crops, but newer ones, known as systemic, are applied to seeds and so distributed throughout the plant as it grows. The fear is that bees are being affected by feeding on nectar and pollen tainted by these new pesticides. Tom and other beekeepers in America began to question the widespread use of chemicals, including imidacloprid, sometimes known as gaucho. The theory was that these chemicals may affect the brains of growing bees, stopping them from being able to find their way home. Because a single bee can visit over 1,000 flowers in a single day, the navigation system is particularly sophisticated. In fact, it's even said that bees can talk. When a bee finds a good flower source, it returns to its hive and performs what's known as the waggle dance, a complicated maneuver which indicates the distance and direction of the food. Other members of the hive can read this dance and then find the nectar source. The problem is getting back again. The question is whether low-level or sub-lethal doses of pesticides are hindering the bee's homing instinct.
France went through problems very similar to what we're talking about now, the colony collapse disorder or the disappearance of bees, and they believed that imidacloprid, gaucho, was causing disorientation in the bees. They would leave and be unable to find their way back. It interfered with their navigational ability. And France banned gaucho.
France suspended the use of the chemical on sunflowers way back in 1999, when beehives fell by 1/3 to 1 million. But the chemical is still widely used elsewhere in Europe and in the US.
Pourquoi vous avez fait ça, monsieur?
Pardon?
Pourquoi vous avez fait ça?
Pour manifester, on leur fait un gros tas de ruches crevées devant, pour leur faire voir ce que c'est que des ruches crevées. Malheureusement, il n'y a pas les abeilles, parce qu'on ne sait pas où elles sont. Et voilà ce qui nous reste.
However, the producers of gaucho say that studies prove that imidacloprid is completely safe for bees and point to independent research that suggests the problems experienced with French bees may have different causes. Indeed, since the ban, French hives have continued to decline in number. In the US, scientists at Penn State are looking into the link between pesticides and colony collapse disorder. And they've stumbled on a whole new issue, that bees are at risk from not one pesticide, but a whole cocktail.
Samples were collected from a number of different beekeepers, some of whom had experienced CCD and some of whom had not. And from that, we found an incredible amount of pesticides.
They found evidence of the systemic pesticide imidacloprid that beekeepers believed were causing the bees to vanish.
We did have a concern, particularly about systemic pesticides. However, in our results, we have found pesticides in every class of pesticides that are currently being used, we have found. So we found insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides.
In just one bee, Marianne found 25 different agrochemicals.
To us, this begs the question, what are these pesticides in combination doing? We all know that when we go to the pharmacist, the first thing they want to know is what other prescriptions are you taking, because they're concerned about the potential interaction of compounds.
The challenge of isolating the effects of a single pesticide was now much harder.
The reason why it's so complicated is that we can't just look at adult bees anymore. We have to ask the question, what happened when this bee was a larva, when it was a baby bee, and what pesticide did it get? And how is that affecting it now as an adult bee? Is it interfering with the bee's longevity? Is it shortening its life? Is it affecting its immune system?
The horrific thought is that not one pesticide, but the whole toxic soup might be having a long-term effect to push bees over the edge.
Well, I wish I could think of some cliche to mouth to make our parting seem less sad.
It's not just in America and France that beekeepers are reporting problems with pesticides. In the UK too, bees are struggling to cope in the changed rural environment.
We've been having big bee losses since 2002. When we brought bees back from pollination, we had them all looked at and inspected, and 2 weeks later they started dying, and we ended up with just bucketfuls of dead bees everywhere, and hundreds of thousands of dead bees.
Though his bees weren't vanishing, they were dying in front of the hives.
If it's one of the recognised diseases, then you know what it is, and hopefully you can take some action. In this scenario, you have no recourse to do anything. Absolutely zilch. You just got to stand by and watch them die, and that's when it's your livelihood. That's pretty tough.
So run, honey, run, and hide in the wind.
Mike knew his bees were struggling because of the lack of wild plants to feed on. But what's startling is the difference he saw when hives were put in farmland.
We had one load of bees that came back from pollination that had all been together from April going back to October. When they came back from pollination, they were split 3 ways. 1/3 went into a wood, 200 acres predominantly of lime trees, and no bees died there at all. And on the other 2 sites, which are in intensive agricultural areas, that's where the colonies collapsed. Something triggered the bees to collapse on those 2 sites. It must be connected with the agricultural crops and the sprays and the seed treatments. I mean, there's no other explanation.
But Mike's never been able to prove a pesticide connection. However, he's not the only British beekeeper suffering massive losses. In the spring of 2008, there were horrific sights across the country when hives were opened up. Nearly 1/3 of Britain's bees had been wiped out. But in a perhaps surprising place, one man's bees are thriving.
I'm an urban beekeeper. That means I keep my bees within urban areas, i.e. the City of London. I've got beehives in South London, Brixton, right through to on an industrial estate up in King's Cross. My bee losses have been no higher in the last few years than I've ever had in any winter, and in fact lower last winter than ever before.
Ironically, in the city, there seems to be more food and perhaps cleaner food for bees to eat.
London and a lot of urban environments are really quite green. When you look around, you see parks, small gardens dotted everywhere. The beautiful thing about keeping bees within an urban environment in the city is the diversity of plants you've got. There's usually something in bloom all year round, whereas in the countryside, especially with modern agricultural practices, you have great swathes of land which are just supporting one crop. So that might bloom for 2-3 weeks, but then there'll be nothing. So I think the city is probably one of the best places to be keeping bees at the moment. There's plenty of forage for them, and you don't have all the problems you have in the countryside with insecticides and pesticides being sprayed. There you go. See you again in a few weeks, girls.
So are pesticides the explanation of why British bees were suddenly dying in such huge numbers? If only it were that simple. At the National Bee Unit in York, government experts are looking into the problem of honeybee deaths.
We've been getting reports both through our own inspectors and from the beekeepers that there's a increased loss of bees. Why that is happening is rather more difficult to pin down.
One cause they feel is a factor is perhaps the biggest global problem of all: climate change.
Climate change is changing weather patterns. It's not just about global warming. It's about weather being unseasonal. If it's very windy or very wet or even snowing out there, pollinators will not forage. They will stay in their hives, and that's meant that honeybees have gone into the winter with poor stocks of food.
But it has to be more than bad weather which is causing British bees to die. As elsewhere, viruses are being spread at an alarming rate. The reason lurks in beehives across the country and is, according to experts, the main cause of bee deaths around the world. It's an old enemy of the honeybee and a known killer, the varroa mite.
The varroa mite is a really very large parasite. So in relation to the size of the bee, it's a thing sort of this big, and it can transmit virus diseases that you normally find in adult bees into the larvae, and virus diseases you find into the larvae into the adults. And it's these virus diseases that have become very devastating.
But I'm a creep.
The parasitic varroa mite was first discovered to have jumped species from the Asian honeybee onto the European honeybee shortly after the Second World War.
From Russia in the 1950s, through Europe in the 1970s, America in the 1980s, Britain in the 1990s, the varroa mite has spread throughout the world.
Like fleas on rats, the varroa carries diseases that are fatal to hives.
Everywhere that varroa has been found around the world, people have reported very high losses of their bees, and often colonies are wiped out completely.
Medicines had been developed to kill the parasite, but over the last few years it's become resistant to chemical treatments. As well as disease, pesticides and climate change, it's left beekeepers battling another foe in the war to keep honeybees alive.
The situation we're in now is that we don't have an easy control of varroa anymore. I'll just get this right.
The new super parasite is devastating colonies. Beekeepers are forced to resort to homemade remedies.
We'll just pick a hive that hopefully is not going to be too stroppy when I take the top. So 50 mils in a syringe, because this stuff should have been a bit warmer than this. This is a syrup solution with 3.5% oxalic acid in. They will eat that, and the acid will hopefully be enough to cause the mites to drop off the bee. Worker bee lasts 6 weeks in the summer. In the winter time they will survive from, say, October through until March, April time. If you've got good healthy bees. If you haven't got healthy bees, then you'll find they're all dead by the spring. They're like my children, so that's how you feel about it. And not knowing that there's anything you can do just makes it worse.
It was a seemingly endless battle for beekeepers just to stay in business. What they needed were solutions, so they decided to take their issues to the seat of government. In November 2008, several hundred beekeepers marched on Parliament.
I run 20 colonies. 20 colonies, yes.
I've got 2. I'm a beginner.
I've been keeping bees for over 40 years now, and certainly the health of bees now is at a greater risk than it has been in the past.
They talked of numerous types of deaths, some from known causes, others more mysterious.